I noticed the advertising had me as the Venerable Peter Russell. The last time I saw Venerable, it was a Venerable Bede, and I think he was a Venerable Saxon in Anglo-Saxon England. My friend here is saying yes. So
It says record.
I don't know what that means. But I am going to talk about a venerable system, parliamentary democracy. Why should you care about democracy? You should care about parliamentary democracy. Why? Why? Why should you care about that? I'll give you some reasons. First of all, it is, of all the systems of democracy, the most popular in the world. There are more parliamentary democracies than any other system. The American system of separately elected president and Congress has not caught on very well. All the former communist states of Europe and Commonwealth countries have adopted parliamentary government. It's a terrific system, and we Canadians were one of the very first to get it, and we got it in 1848. And did you hear that? 1848, huh? Got it? Got it? 1848. Yes, we got a system where the government of the day has to be directed by politicians who command the confidence of the elected branch of Parliament. That's parliamentary government. You don't elect the government, you elect the Parliament. And you get to run the government by having the confidence of the Parliament. It's great virtue, the great virtue of parliamentary democracy. It can give you, and it should give you when it's operating as it ought to, its virtue is discursive government, government by discussion. So from the discussion in Parliament emerges a position that a majority can adopt, and that directs the government. That's the virtue of parliamentary democracy. But the other side of the virtue is its vice. He said vice, my goodness. What's this going to be? Well, it's that the executive, the head of government, also sits in the legislature. There's a fusion of powers, and the executive could come to dominate the legislature and stifle the virtue, the discussion. That has particularly become a danger in the era, and it's not all history, of strong, disciplined political parties organizing the debate in legislative assemblies, in Parliament. We went through quite a few decades in the 19th century when political parties were very loosely defined in Parliament. They campaigned, but they didn't have a strict discipline in Parliament. Beginning in the 20th century, though, parties got more and more strongly disciplined, and here is our particular problem in Canada and in the United Kingdom. The tendency of the executive to dominate, the Prime Minister to dominate the discussion in Parliament is increased many times when, wait for it, one party majority government can happen. And you will say, doesn't it happen all the time? No! Most of the 48 parliamentary democracies in the world don't have first past the post. They have some system of proportional representation. And that means in our day and age, to get 50% of the electorate liking you is almost impossible. There are very few countries in the world where any political party pleases 50% of the people. So it's only when you have the distortions of first past the post, as in the United Kingdom and Canada, where virtually the last holdouts of that system, that's the place where you can, as Mr. Harper has shown, get 39% of the people's vote and over 50% of the seats in the Legislative Assembly. And what happens to the virtue of parliamentary democracy when that vice is so apparent? Well, we've seen it. And by the way, not just with Mr. Harper, Mr. Chrétien had a single party, he had a majority for his party, and Jeffrey Simpson wrote a terrific book called a friendly dictatorship. I don't know what was friendly about it, but it was certainly dictatorial, with no interest and no play for really the discussion in Parliament, which is the virtue of parliamentary democracy. So we're at a point now where we're experiencing single party, right? Whoops, I lost this, it's gone.
No, you're still on.
No? Single party majority government. Now Wayne is going to tell you lots about the alternatives. And when you look ahead to what we should do, I got a little more time, I suggest there's three very different but very important avenues of reform. But number one is the structural reform of our electoral system. Don't let anybody kid you. There is no substitute for getting away for first past the post. You are going to be afflicted with Kratians and Harpers dominating the parliamentary discussion, partly because not only are they one-party majority governments, but since the Trudeau era, the style of government by single-party majority governments has turned to a very corporate style. It really started with Trudeau. Yep. They build up very big offices of the Prime Minister, whose job it is to sell the government, and I pause, brand. We don't have policy anymore, we have a brand, like a corporation, which is to be spun by the most important office of government, which is the Prime Minister's office, which becomes more important than the Cabinet, because in Cabinet they discuss policy. There's no room in a corporation selling a product, a brand, to discuss very much. You know the brand, and the main brand you have out there is to get you more votes and keep your power. And your main way of communicating with the public is to sell it like soap or cars or some product. Now that's what you're faced with if we continue again with first past the post. So that structural change is for me, and for many of my colleagues in political science, that's number one. There's no other, if you don't do that, nothing else good will really happen. Number two is within Parliament, there are things that can be done right now to make a little more less leader-centric and less party-centric. And we have a very good MP, a Conservative MP, working on that, and I'm a champion of his. His name is Michael Chon. He left the Harper government, but he has a huge majority as a Conservative in Halton Hills. He's working with the Greens, with the Liberals, with the Bloc, and with the NDP, across all benches in his own party, on a set of reforms of Parliament. They're basically to reduce the power of party leaders. I can talk more about this in the discussion. One of the key changes is the party leader's ability and power, which was, Parliament gave it to him almost accidentally, to veto a local riding's choice of candidates. That happened in 1974 for the first time when we put the ballot for federal elections had parties beside the candidates' names, and what turned out to give party leaders a chance to, well, not just a chance, the power to veto a candidate that a local organization, riding organization, is elected. Michael Chon has a number of reforms. Boris probably knows about them. I hope he'll be supporting them. His time for a private member's bill comes up next September, and I'm hoping there is some real support across party lines in the House for Michael Chon's reforms. So that's the second avenue. The third, looking at this room, you may not be aware of it, is the civic education of our young people, which we have been measuring in political science, and it's abysmal. And so is their interest in participation in parliamentary democracy. The lowest turnout are the newest voters, 18 to 25. They're below 40%. And Ontario is the only province of the 10 in which civics is a mandatory course in grade 10. And we've been looking at it, and while that's better than no mandatory civics course, it's not a very good course. A group of us have been through the textbooks. They're full of errors, they're full of mistakes. They tell you nothing about what I've just spoken about. They tell you nothing about parliamentary democracy. They don't prepare our young people for citizenship in a parliamentary democracy. And that's just vital. Henry Milner and Paul Howell, who are leading political sciences, who survey literacy among people, I'll just give you one example. One measure of literacy is the number of provinces you can name. About 20 years ago, the average for even a high school student was 7. It's now down to 3. Three is average. Now, I mean, so we're not talking about a fancy theory of government that these people have to have. Obviously, something is happening in the homes. They're not tuned in to the politics of parliamentary democracy. Well, I've spoken enough. Those are the 3 areas where I think we have to work. But I might say, in closing, you're a 4th area all over this country. There are groups like your own who are very, very concerned about the state of our democracy today. They're bubbling up, and I think that's fine. They have their own focus. Many of them are very active on the internet, and I think that's the strongest check and balance right now on Mr. Harper, quite frankly. His support a week ago Monday, we found, was 34.6%, with a lot going for him. He's dropped 5 points. I think you people have a lot to do with capping his support. So I'll stop there. So thank God you're showing this concern, and I hope you do care about parliamentary democracy.
Thank you very much, Professor Russell. I had no idea there would be so much loose talk about parliamentary vice, but I hope no one will remember what year we gained our parliamentary democracy.
1848.
There you go. Man, I'll introduce Wayne Smith, Executive Director of Fair Vote Canada.
Hi, everybody. As he said, I'm Wayne Smith. I'm the Executive Director of Fair Vote Canada. That's fairvote.ca. We are a citizens movement to change the voting system in Canada. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, wait a minute, the government is perfect. I love politicians. What could possibly be wrong with our voting system? Well, our voting system doesn't work. It doesn't work in the very straightforward and literal sense that most of the people we vote for don't get elected. Let me just remind you how it works. We divide the country up into 300-odd little individual electoral districts that we call ridings. Nobody else in the world calls them that, by the way. That's a Canadian thing. And we elect 1 member of parliament in each riding. You get a list of candidates. Most of them are nominated by parties. Some of them are independents. You put an X beside one of them. Whoever gets the most X's is the winner. And they get to go to the parliament, and everybody else loses. Well, sometimes those people get 60–70% of the votes in their riding, but usually not. Sometimes, I mean, as long as they got more votes than anybody else, they get elected. So sometimes they get elected with 36% or 26% of the votes. On average, somewhere between 40 and 50% of the votes to elect a member of parliament. And that's true in the federal parliament and in the Ontario legislature. But wait a minute, if 40% of us are voting for people to get elected, that means 60% of us are voting for people who don't get elected. Most of us in Canada are represented in Parliament and in our provincial legislature by people we voted against. How screwy is that? It's the same system we've been using since 1848, and let's be clear, we are privileged. We are very privileged to live in Canada, a country where, I mean, people around the world, as I speak, are literally dying to have what we have, the ability to change our government, and nobody gets shot, or well, hardly anybody. But the reality is that, and contrary to the way we think of ourselves, we are in fact one of the world's oldest democracies. And some of our democratic institutions are a little creaky with age. One could mention the Senate, but the one that concerns Fair Vote Canada mostly is our voting system. It's an antique system, And as Peter mentioned, in 1848, the modern political party, as we understand it, basically didn't exist. So the electors in their riding, and in those days there were maybe 1,500, 2,000 electors in a riding, and they were all white middle-aged property owners. They all mostly knew each other, and the object, they all knew the candidates, and so the object was to choose somebody to send to Ottawa to make sure that our district got its fair share of the pork that was being distributed. And the system works very well for that purpose, and it still works very well for that purpose. And the epitome of this is the United States, where they have the same system, and but aggravated by scale. Instead of 90,000 people in a riding, a member of the United States Congress has 700,000 constituents, so he's not out knocking on doors. And it's all about the television, it's all about the money, and every single bill that goes through the Congress is decided by the question of will this or will it not put a defense plan in my district. So, but about 100 years ago, the modern political party evolved as a machine for electing people. Since then, it's almost impossible to get elected without the support of a political party organization. And that's when this process of centralization of power more or less began. It's been going on for 100 years. As Peter pointed out, it accelerated rapidly around the time that Pierre Trudeau got in power, and the epitome of it, of course, is the current Prime Minister, who doesn't even allow our scientists to talk about the papers they've published in peer-reviewed journals. That's absolute control of power. But it's not, again, the problem is not Stephen Harper, the problem is the system. And as they pointed out, the Jean Chrétien had a government with 38% of the votes. Here in Ontario, we had an NDP government that had a majority government with 38% of the votes. That's not even the worst thing that can happen under the system. When a system where most of the votes make absolutely no difference to the outcome of election, sometimes it happens that the party with the most votes loses the election. What? How can that happen? Well, that's a freak occurrence. Well, it happened in 1996 in British Columbia. They had an election. The Liberals got the most votes. But the NDP got the most seats. They formed a majority government, in fact, with fewer votes than the Liberals. Okay, well, it could happen once. Couldn't happen twice, except in 1998 in Quebec, they had a provincial election. The Liberals got the most votes, but the Parti Québécois got the most seats. In fact, they formed a majority government with fewer votes than the Liberals. Well, okay, it could happen twice, couldn't happen three times, except that in 2006 in New Brunswick they had an election. This time it was the Conservatives that got the most votes, but the Liberals got the most seats with fewer votes. In fact, they got a majority government with fewer. So anyway, you get the point. Our system doesn't work, and that's only one of the things. We've identified 5 major problems with our current voting system. One is this blatant distortion of results, because the fact that most votes don't count. But the system also discriminates against, it throws up barriers to the election of women and minorities. If you're only electing one candidate in a riding, what's your incentive? What kind of candidate are you looking for? Well, you're looking for the least common denominator. The last thing you want is anybody who's different in any way. And in these days, it's being a woman is still being different in politics. So, and certainly being in an ethnic minority of any kind is different. So it's very hard to get elected. Well, excuse me, it's not hard to get elected, it's hard to get nominated if you're a woman or an ethnic minority. A third problem is voter choices. Because there's only one winner and everybody else is a loser, it basically comes down to 2 parties. Most of us live in safe ridings. 2/3 of us already know who's going to get elected in our riding before the votes are cast. So we, in fact, have no choice. We vote. I live in Davenport riding. My member of parliament for 20 years was Charles Katcha. Nice fella, don't get me wrong. Don't have a problem with Charles Katcha, but I knew that if I voted for Charles Katcha, he'd get elected. If I voted for somebody else, Charles Katcha would get elected anyway. And if I didn't bother to vote, he would still get elected. So why would I bother getting up off the couch and going voting? And more Canadians are not bothering, especially young people. In fact, the people who don't vote at all are the largest political party in Canada. They're over 40%. The government's got 39.6%. So there's problem number 3. Number 4, geographic representation. This system's based entirely on geographic representation, so surely it at least should give you good geographic representation. Except that The way the Liberals formed majority governments was by winning 101 seats out of 103 in Ontario with 58% of the votes. The Conservatives, they win all the seats or all but one in Alberta. Did they get all the votes? No, they get 65% of the votes. Liberals get 25% of the votes in Alberta. They don't elect anybody. That's the way the system works. If your votes are spread out across the country, like the NDP or the Green Party can get almost 1 million votes and not elect anybody at all. On the other hand, if your votes are concentrated in one region, like the Reform Party, then you can form the official opposition. And the Bloc Québécois, of course, is up until the last election, the Bloc Québécois got more seats than the NDP, in spite of the fact that they got half as many votes. Why? Because their votes are all concentrated in one region, so they got 2/3 of the seats with 1/3 of the votes. And the final problem is accountability. I mean, to me, this is all about accountability. I want my politicians to be accountable to voters. I want political parties to be accountable to voters, and I want the government to be accountable to the legislature. Once one party's got a phony majority government, there is no accountability. So I've probably blathered on enough for now, so I will stop, but I'll just say fairvote.ca. We've got some literature over on the table there. There's some buttons in here. Check it out. We are a membership organization. Please get involved. Give us $10, become a member, sign up, become a volunteer.
Thank you very much. That was Wayne Smith, and the website is fairvote.ca. That's very good. Last but certainly not least, we have Boris Jasinski, a former MP representing the Liberal Party out in Etobicoke. I'm sure many interesting stories, both from Parliament and from his recent experience with Elections Canada. So we'll throw it open to Boris. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank Why Should I Care, the crew, for organizing this and providing a forum for Canadians that care and care deeply about where our country's heading. And there's something actually quite appropriate in the fact that we've gathered in a pub. There's a long tradition, a Canadian tradition, of political activists gathering in pubs. And in fact, I'd almost like to believe that there's a little bit of the spirit of Montgomery's Inn amongst us here today. You know, the revolt of Upper Canada. And there are echoes of that era in what's taking place today. Of course, at that time, it was seen through the prism of republicanism and the monarchy, loyalty to the monarch. Today, it's about democracy, having a voice, and autocracy. And it's been a continuous struggle. Now, as we were sitting at the table prior to the start of this event, we were chatting, and I remember, I guess it was 3 years ago, I was at a conference of constitutional scholars, academics, lawyers here in Toronto, and I was asked to speak about the state of Canadian democracy. And at that time, I lamented, because I said that we were a devolving democracy. And in fact, our House of Commons, in many ways, was almost becoming a symbolic institution. Well, since that time, 3 years ago, the House of Commons has become no better than the Senate. It's a symbolic institution. Louder, perhaps, but it really doesn't decide anything. And perhaps in the question period, we can get into some of the details of how we can fix things. And I'm sure Michael Chong has refined his private members bill, because there are areas, whether it's parliamentary committees, question period, there's so much that could be done to set the rules in ways so that individual MPs have more of a voice, are empowered. But there's also a serious problem with the political culture within our parties. And we can, during the question period, talk about that as well. But 3 years ago, I could not have foreseen and would never have expected that the most foundational aspect of a democracy, and as flawed as our electoral processes happen to be. But I never could have imagined 3 years ago that the actual will of the people, according to the rules of the game as they exist at the current time, could be subverted. And that's what happened. And not quite 2 years ago, I had an evening where I had some very difficult choices to make. It was a couple weeks after the election of May 2nd, 2011. And there was a realization that something fundamental broke. And you have to remember, that was before, almost a year before the robocall story broke. Most Canadians were oblivious to what had happened in the election of 2011. But I had people coming forward, bringing me bits and pieces of how the electoral process had been subverted in Etobicoke Centre. Different vote suppression tactics. So vote suppression, and also on the other side of the ledger, a story that largely has been told. It's not just vote suppression, it's vote addition as well. And I'll give you a few examples of the sorts of things we uncovered. I had Elections Canada officials search me out and inform me how they had found out who had actually shut down voting in 2 of the polls in Etobicoke Centre. Similar to what was attempted at the University of Guelph, unsuccessfully because the students wouldn't allow the vote location to be shut down, they actually succeeded in Etobicoke Centre. They succeeded in shutting down 2 polls. Happened to be 2 of my strongest polls. Now, I'm of Ukrainian Canadian heritage. One of the places that were shut down was the Ukrainian Canadian seniors residence in my riding. And just by the nature of it, it's the way it is, but I tend to get about 80-85% of the vote there. And these Elections Canada officials described how on election day they observed 3 men come into the complex. One was seen going through the whole complex, removing the vote reminder cards from the seniors' doors. And then after breakfast, all the seniors, unlike the youth that we only have barely a 40% turnout, most of those seniors vote. It's actually a very exciting day for them. So they were lined up after breakfast to vote. The poll opens up, and all of a sudden, these men started yelling at the seniors. Actually, in the sworn affidavits of the Elections Canada officials, they said they were raging at the seniors, physically blocking them, to the point that a lady in a walker got knocked over. The Elections Canada officials had to shut down the vote because all the seniors, intimidated, had left and either got onto a bus for a day trip or went back to the rooms, and many of them never came back to vote. So it wasn't just the calls, and we've documented various forms of vote suppression using the phone systems, but it was as blunt as that. But then we also had an allegation brought to us by an individual where she said an Elections Canada official, in fact, was handing out ballots without checking for IDs. And when we looked at the results in that particular poll, we saw a statistical anomaly. And it was a small apartment poll. And there were several on that street. And all the other apartments seemed to be within the parameters of what the overall results were in the riding. But in that particular apartment, there was a spike in voter turnout and a spike in the Conservative vote. Now, I've been an electoral observer overseas for Canada on behalf of the OSCE, and we've often done statistical analyses. We did a whole battery of those during the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. And in our reports, based on statistical analysis, we said fraud, electoral fraud, ballot box stuffing had occurred. When we looked at the statistical analysis of all the polls in Etobicoke Centre, lo and behold, we found a handful of polls where there was a spike of 30 to 50% of voter turnout, and in those same polls, there was a 40 to 70% increase in the Conservative vote. Statistically impossible. So I took this information to the Liberal Party, and I was sure that something would be done. Now you have to remember that the party was pretty devastated after that last federal election. And the response was basically, Boris, you're just going to have to roll with it. We don't have the resources to fight this. The law is written in a way that the odds are stacked against you. You probably have less than a 10% chance of winning this in the courts. And, you know, we're just going to have to wait till the next federal election. And I went home, spoke with my wife, and then I sat there thinking, I said, this can't be right. And it was quite personal for me. You see, I'm the son and grandson of political refugees. Both my parents and all four of my grandparents. Canada was freedom's shores. And the first time, and you talked about civics and civic education, the first time that I saw the vote process was in the old sort of displaced persons neighborhood. We call it the old DP neighborhood of Queen and Bathurst. When my grandmother took me by the hand to the vote location and explained what it was all about. And she never missed a vote. And there wasn't any way that I could just roll with this. Because as flawed, and that has to be addressed, as flawed as our system is, there's a social contract that, okay, these are the rules, and based upon these rules, there's a result, and we may not all be happy with it, but based upon that result, we agree to be governed by this particular contingent that ends up in Parliament. But if the will of the people has been subverted, what is the legitimacy of the laws enacted in the legislature by individuals who in fact may well not have been elected? And I have to tell you, I don't believe that Etobicoke Centre was the only place where this occurred. There were layers to it. The vote suppression part is the easiest to see because what you're doing with vote suppression is you're taking something away from someone who's not willingly giving it up. Vote addition is done in the shadows. It's sophisticated, and it doesn't show itself. It displayed itself through statistics. Probably in the question period, I'll address some of the court process that I went through. And let me just briefly note that why I was advised that I have less than a 10% chance. In fact, it turned out that 4 judges through this process ruled in my favor and 4 ruled against. And in fact, the Chief Justice and the two most senior members of the Supreme Court, in their dissenting opinion, in one place wrote, the Chief Justice, McLaughlin, she wrote, "I cannot accept this opinion." But we have no choice as Canadians. We actually have to accept it. But preparing for a potential by-election, I was adamant that the nomination in Etobicoke Centre should take place in that seniors' residence, even though the facility wasn't large enough, and people from the party saying, "Boris, your people aren't going to come out. It's, people are going to have to stand in the border." I said, "It doesn't matter. What matters is that it take place in that particular facility." And at the end of the nomination meeting, a lady got up and she said, "Boris, I'm 88 years old and I can't see so well." And then she turned around and pointed to the crowd and she said, "And many of us here can't hear so well. In fact, many of us can't walk so well. But come the next election, after what they did to us, consider us your army." Well, friends, we need to build an army in Canada. An army of not just liberals, but of progressives, of Democrats. We all have to come together because Mr. Harper is not only bending the future course of this country in a very different direction, he's fundamentally changing the state of our democracy. And it's time that we all got together to bring back Canadian democracy. Thank you.